Hi guys, welcome to Module 13. We are about a week away from the midterm, so I hope your class projects are going well. This week we're going to continue to build upon some of the things we talked about earlier in the class. We are going to talk about anonymity and privacy. And those two things, it turns out, are actually quite different, and there's different ways to accomplish them. So we're going to talk about how we can actually provide anonymity and privacy, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Tor network, which you've probably heard a lot about, but I'm not sure if you know exactly how it works. So we'll see a little bit of a demo how these distributed router networks, they act like an onion in the sense that there's many layers that you have to peel off, and how they can provide anonymity on the web. So hope you're looking forward to the lecture, and let's get started. So first we're going to talk about what is privacy. We hear this a lot nowadays, especially with, as we talked about, all the devices that generate all sorts of data, and they represent many of the different aspects of our lives. So what specifically is privacy? When we talk about privacy, we're going to jump back to the very beginning of the class, and in this case, we're going to focus on the C, which was confidentiality, the CIA triad. And what privacy basically means in an online sense is it's the confidentiality of the actions that you take and the things that you do online. So I have here confidentiality of your online actions and habits. Basically, you may want to keep the things that you do private from other people and not have them be able to see a list of maybe the websites that you visit or your purchase history on Amazon, things of that nature, your social media posts, your movie reviews, anything else that you might do online, you may want to keep private for various reasons. And so when we talk about privacy, you hear this interesting saying, usually it seems like the conservative school of thought is that the only people who need privacy are those who are up to something. So in other words, if you want privacy, it's because maybe you're trying to hide something. And I'm not certain I agree with it, although I am pretty sure that people who are trying to commit crimes or things of that nature, yeah, they probably want to keep their actions pretty private. But just think about, do you lock the door when you take a shower or when you visit a restroom or something? Are you requesting privacy because you're up to something malicious or just simply because you want some level of privacy? It's not something that needs to be shared with other people and you'd rather keep the experience to yourself. And the same is true in an online perspective. There are definitely things you want to keep private. Your bank account, for example, you probably want to keep it private because we want to keep our net worth to ourselves. It's not something we share. We don't share our annual salary with people, things of that nature. They're just things about us that we want to keep private. And we see increasingly that there's a large call for privacy, but at the same time, this constant connectivity that we have nowadays also makes us want to share things a lot more openly. And it turns out, as we saw in one of our discussions I posted to a few of you guys, Professor Ed Felton at Princeton University, he testified in front of Congress about the NSA's leaked program that looked at phone call metadata to try to locate targets or things of that nature. And in some cases, metadata can be just as telling as the data itself. So as we also saw, the Fourth Amendment rights are now extended to cell phones because they contain a sufficient amount of private data that we want to keep to ourselves. So that's another example of the increasing desire to have privacy, but contrast that with how eager people are to share intimate details. People on Facebook often post where they're traveling to, when they're expecting their next child, the fact that they just got married, new job, moving to a new location, and things of that nature. So there's this definite give and take between privacy in theory and privacy in practice. And as we've seen throughout the course of the class, that line, I think, changes for everybody. Certain people care to keep certain aspects of their lives private. Other people may not. So that's a sliding scale, and it's obviously not the same for each and every individual, as we've talked about at length in some of the discussions. So how's that different than anonymity? Some people think that being private is the same thing as being anonymous, and they're actually quite different, but in a subtle sense. So anonymity refers to masking the identity of a person performing an online action. So it doesn't actually mask the action itself. That would be privacy. Anonymity more refers to the fact that you cannot trace an action back to a specific entity. So for example, if, let's say I wanted to review your movie, so I go to your blog and I give it a 0 stars. I may not want you to know who I am so that you can't take some sort of retaliatory action against me. So I may try to post that anonymously under a pseudonym, or may do it through an encrypted anonymous network. There's a number of ways to accomplish it, but it's very subtly different. So as you see here, the action can be seen publicly. So that negative post about my negative movie review about your new film, other people can read it, but they just can't trace it back to me. And I think it's clear why we might want anonymity in different settings. So for example, here, I wrote a few use cases down. Think of a company, maybe a large company like Google, and they want to purchase a company who is perfecting a new emerging technology. And so Google goes around, digging into online records, looking at financial statements, doing research about the technology. If someone were to know that Google was doing something like that, they may be able to buy the company that Google is interested in purchasing. Traders could certainly capitalize on that fact if they knew Google was going to acquire, say, an augmented reality firm. They could invest in that company or invest in Google ahead of time and benefit financially from the situation. So you can see how it definitely makes sense from a competitive in a competitive commercial sense for people to remain anonymous. Anonymity can also be useful in the case of government and law enforcement. So take, for example, someone who is an informant and they want to give tips to either the government or to law enforcement agencies that will help them solve some sort of crime, but they don't want to risk the government or the law enforcement officials they're in contact with blowing their cover, let's say. So that's an ideal use case for anonymity, where the person can give the data to the officials without their identity actually becoming known, so that they don't risk becoming compromised as an asset. So hopefully the distinction between privacy and anonymity is clear. Privacy masks the actions that are being performed, while anonymity doesn't look to mask the action, but it looks to mask the identity of the person performing that action. So the two definitely go hand in hand. And I want to talk a little bit more about how can we achieve anonymity. So I put together a little bit of a demo here. We're going to go into the workings of some distributed routing networks like Tor and give you a high-level overview of how networks like that work. So let's take a look. Now that we've seen the definitions for privacy and anonymity, I wanted to show you guys a more concrete and more formal example of how we can achieve anonymity on the web. So in the case I've drawn here, we have 3 Alices, A1, A2, and A3, who wish to communicate messages anonymously to B1, B2, or B3. So a very common way to do this for A1, A2, A3 to be able to conceal their identity from the Bobs would be to use a simple relay in the middle. And that would look something like this. So here's a relay, and let's say that A1 wishes to post an anonymous review, an anonymous negative review, to B3's website. So A1 is going to go ahead and send the intended recipient, which is B3, and a piece of negative feedback, which we'll call X. And it's going to send this to R. R knows that B3 is the intended recipient, so R just simply sends X over to B3. Now in theory, all B3 knows, they got a negative piece of feedback, but they don't know which Alice it came from. They're not really able to say whether it came from A1, A2, or A3 with any level of certainty. So this kind of achieves our anonymity goal, but not in a very strong way. So for example, if there was someone listening on the link between A1 and the relay, they could be listening right here. They see in plain text very clearly that A1 is sending a message to B3, and they know what that message is. So they could communicate this information back to B3 as follows, and B3 could then actually link the negative feedback to A1. So while it provides anonymity in a basic sense, you can see that it's very easy to circumvent this relay mechanism. A better approach here for A1 to anonymously send their message to B3 would be for A1 to encrypt their message before they send it to the relay. That would look something like this. A1 would go to R and ask for R's public key. A1 would take the public key and then encrypt the same message as before, which was the identity of the intended recipient, B3, and then their message, which was their negative review, which we call X. A sends this to the relay. The relay uses its private key to decrypt the message. And then, once again, the relay knows, as before, that A1 intends to send B3 this message X. So just as before, R delivers X to B3. Okay. Now, hopefully you can see in this case that someone snooping here as they were before is actually not able to link A1 to the message X, or the fact that A1 wanted to send the message X to B3 because it's encrypted en route to the relay. And then as before, we have the same anonymity guarantee that B3 only knows that it received the message X from the relay R, but B3 has no way to say with any degree of certainty that X came from either A1, A2, or A3 specifically. This then seems to be a pretty good provider of anonymity in this case, but unfortunately, it's still not sufficient to be completely anonymous, and here's why. We know that A1 is communicating with the relay, A2 and A3 are sending messages to B1, B2, and B3. And they're encrypted, so someone listening either over here or over here is not able to make any relationship to the fact that A1 is sending a message to, say, B3, like we saw in the previous example. But here's what they can do. They can listen on these channels, and they can listen on these channels. And let's say A1 is sending a message to B1. Then the observer is going to see that the relay has received a message from A1 on the left-hand side. So if they monitor the right-hand side, they know with pretty high likelihood that since A1's message went into the relay first, the first message out of that relay probably came from A1. They can't necessarily guarantee it because we don't know if the relay has any kind of built-in randomized delay or anything like that. But they can definitely begin to guess. They can correlate packets based on timing. And similarly for A2, if A2 sends the second packet to the relay, then someone sniffing on the right can probably conjecture that the second packet to come out of the relay is from A2, and the attacker can report that fact to B2 and say, hey, based on the timing, the inputs and the outputs of the packets, the message that you received was most likely from A2. So there's a whole series of timing attacks that break apart the scheme that we just showed in the previous slide. And in fact, there was an attack that was demonstrated against Tor that worked exactly like this. So while you can't see the encrypted message contents and you can't see the encrypted network layer headers, they were able to, with about 60 to 70% efficacy, they were able to profile the packet's timing on the ingress to the Tor network and on the egress of the Tor network. And they were able to say with a fair level of certainty that a given packet came from a particular identity. Another problem here, not paying attention to the timing attacks, is the fact that how do A1, A2, A3, and B1, B2, and B3 know that they can trust this relay? For example, if A1 asks the relay, So A1 asks the relay to send a positive review to B1. What is stopping the relay from sending a positive review, but instead of sending it to the intended recipient, it sends it to B2 instead? Well, the answer in this case is nothing. The relay, if it's compromised, or if it's just a malicious relay that we've mistakenly trusted, the relay can send that message to anyone it wants to. Not only that, but the opposite case could be true. Maybe R does send our message to B1 as we intended, but maybe they take this positive review and they replace it with a negative review. That's another concern here. The other point that's worth mentioning is the fact that also a single relay becomes a single point of failure. So if this relay is compromised, or let's say it just goes down completely, then there is no way to enforce anonymity in this network anymore. And A1 is forced to talk directly to either B1, B2, or B3 in a completely unanonymized sense. What we commonly see in practice nowadays is a distributed router network that allows Alice to send a message M into the network that's intended for Bob, and it takes some circuitous path throughout this network, but in the end, Bob's connected to the other end, and Bob receives the message M that Alice intended to send him, but is not able to link the message M back to Alice. So if you're looking at this and you're thinking Tor, you're exactly right. This is exactly how Tor works. So in this case, you can see Alice sends a message to R1. And you might be thinking, okay, well, if R1 is compromised, or we could have an issue here because R1 knows that Alice is the one sending the message, but it's kind of okay because R1 doesn't know that Bob is the intended recipient. All R1 knows is that R2 is the intended recipient. So R1 forwards the message to R2. And similarly, R2 doesn't know that the message came from Alice, and R2 also doesn't know that the message is intended for Bob. So R2 forwards the packet or forwards the message to R3, similarly to R4, and then similarly the message gets forwarded to R5. All R5 knows is that the message is intended for Bob, so he relays it to Bob, but R5 has no idea that the message came from Alice. Right? All R5 knows is that the message came from R4. So yes, in theory, if the first hop has been compromised, yes, R1 knows that the message came from Alice, but doesn't know who the intended recipient is. And similarly, if R5, the last hop router, is compromised, yes, it knows the message is intended for Bob, but R5 has no idea that that message came from Alice. And this is an improvement upon the single relay, because let's say, for example, we lose R3. So for some reason, R3 went down. It's not difficult to reroute the connections from R2 around R3 to R4, and then the network flow can continue as normal. Building from our previous example, however, we do see that there's an issue here. Once again, Alice is transmitting a message through a router network, but the message is unencrypted. So someone could see that Alice sent M to R1 here, and someone could be listening here, someone could listen here, and then finally someone could listen here. And once they see M come across again, they're going to be able to correlate this event with this event, and then they're going to know that Alice was actually the one who sent the message M to Bob. So we do need some kind of confidentiality step here, some encryption step, as we saw before with the single relay case, in order to keep this attack from being feasible. So we can accomplish that as follows. Think back to our discussion about the SET protocol and some of our discussions on SSL and public key crypto. Remember how SSL worked. Initially, if Alice and Bob wanted to exchange messages, they use their public and private key to exchange a symmetric key, right? Because public key crypto is computationally, it's slow. So they use that just for the initial step to trade a symmetric key, and then they're able to go about their SSL encrypted conversation from there. So the way the encrypted version of this works is as follows. Let's just say, for simplicity's sake, that Alice knows R1, R2, and R3's public keys and wants to send a message M to Bob. Alice begins by taking R3's key and encrypting the message M. So that looks just like this. She encrypts. Alice encrypts with the public key of R3 the message M. Then she encrypts that with the public key of router 2. And then once again encrypts all of that with the public key of router 1. She then sends this entire blob to R1, and as you know, R1 can only undo the outermost level of encryption here. So this level of encryption goes away. And then all R1 can see is that the message then is destined for R2. So forwards the encrypted packet to R2. R2 uses its private key to be able to unlock this message, and so. And then R2 forwards this packet to R3. R3 uses, once again, its own private key to unlock this message. And now it has the message M to send to Bob. So R3 could either send M unencrypted to Bob, or if it really wanted to, R3 could encrypt the message M using Bob's public key. So we could use eBob. And send that message to Bob, who could then decrypt it using his private key. And then Bob's left with the original message M that was sent by Alice, but Bob has no idea that the message came from Alice. And then any nefarious party who was listening in on any of the links of the way, all they could see was encrypted traffic. So they would also not be able to ultimately link the message M as having been sent to Bob by Alice.